The summer heat pressed down on the South Bronx like a heavy blanket soaked in sweat and desperation. The year was 1988, and the streets were a war zone where crack cocaine had turned neighborhoods into hunting grounds and children into casualties. This is the story of the Reyes family, Dominican immigrants who came to America chasing dreams of safety and prosperity, only to watch their daughter fall into a nightmare that would transform them from law-abiding citizens into instruments of brutal justice. What they did over the course of 3 blood-soaked months would send shockwaves through the criminal underworld and force an entire city to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and how far a parent will go to protect their child. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most shocking events. Drop a like if you're ready for a story that will leave you speechless, and comment below telling us what you think about vigilante justice. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Reyes family arrived in New York City in 1979, part of the massive wave of Dominican immigration that transformed Washington Heights and the South Bronx during the 70s and 80s. Roberto Reyes was a mechanic who could fix anything with an engine. His wife, Carmen, worked double shifts at a textile factory in Manhattan, her fingers moving with practiced precision over industrial sewing machines. They had 3 children: Miguel, the oldest at 16, Maria, who was 14, and little Carlos, just 8 years old. They lived in a 4th-floor walk-up on Prospect Avenue, where the building superintendent let Roberto work off part of the rent by handling repairs. Roberto was the kind of man who believed in the American promise with an almost religious fervor. He'd left Santo Domingo because he wanted his children to have opportunities he never had. He wanted them to go to college, to become doctors or lawyers or engineers. Every morning before work, he'd sit with his coffee and remind his children that education was the ladder out of poverty. Carmen shared his dreams but understood better than her husband how dangerous their neighborhood had become. She saw it in the eyes of young men on the corners, in the way her daughter had to walk past drug dealers just to get to the bodega. Maria Reyes was everything her parents hoped for. She was a straight-A student at Morris High School, a girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's determined jaw. She wanted to be a nurse. She volunteered at the community center, helping elderly neighbors with their English and reading to children whose parents worked late shifts. Her teachers called her exceptional. Her friends called her the responsible one. The girl who always had her homework done, who never missed curfew, who looked out for everyone else. That's what made what happened next so devastating. It started so innocently that the family didn't notice until it was almost too late. In the spring of 1988, Maria met a boy named Danny at a house party. He was 19, charming, with an easy smile and nice clothes. He drove a new car and always had money in his pockets. Maria knew what that meant in the South Bronx, but Danny told her he was different, that he was saving up to go to college, that he just needed to make some fast money to get out. She believed him because she was 14 and he made her feel special, and because she didn't understand yet that predators often wear the most attractive masks. Danny introduced her to his friends. They hung out at an apartment on Freeman Street, a place that always seemed to have people coming and going, where music played loud enough to shake the windows. At first, it was just somewhere to go after school. They'd smoke cigarettes and listen to hip-hop and dance. Maria told her parents she was studying at her friend's house. Carmen was suspicious, but Roberto believed his daughter because she'd never given them reason not to. The drugs came gradually. First, someone passed around a joint. Then cocaine. Maria tried it once at a party and felt like she could fly. The stress of maintaining perfect grades, of being the good daughter, of carrying her family's dreams on her shoulders, it all melted away for a few hours. She told herself she could handle it, that she wasn't like the addicts she saw on street corners. She was smarter than that. She had control. But crack cocaine doesn't care how smart you are. It doesn't care about your dreams or your family or your future. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left. By June, Maria was using regularly. Danny and his crew had exactly what they wanted: a pretty girl from a good family who could move product to kids at her school, who could bring in new customers, who would do anything for another hit. They didn't force her. They didn't have to. The drug did their work for them. They just made sure she always had access, always had just enough to keep her coming back. Carmen noticed the changes first. Maria had always been meticulous about her appearance, but now her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, had developed a hollow quality. She snapped at her little brother for no reason. She stopped volunteering at the community center. Her grades began to slip. When Carmen tried to talk to her, Maria screamed that her mother was suffocating her, that she needed space, that she was almost 15 and could make her own decisions. Roberto wanted to believe it was just teenage rebellion. He'd heard that adolescence could be difficult, that kids pushed boundaries. But Carmen knew something darker was happening. She'd seen addiction before. In Santo Domingo, she'd lost a brother to alcohol and pills. She recognized the signs, the lying, the mood swings, the way Maria's hands sometimes shook at the dinner table. In July, everything came crashing down. Maria didn't come home one night. Roberto called the police, but they barely wrote down the information. Another runaway teenager in the South Bronx. They had bigger problems. Roberto and Miguel spent the night driving through the neighborhood, checking parks and abandoned buildings, asking everyone they saw if they'd seen Maria. At dawn, they found her passed out in a stairwell on Westchester Avenue, her lips cracked and bleeding, her body so thin that Roberto could count her ribs when he lifted her into his arms. At the hospital, the doctors were blunt. Maria was severely malnourished. She had burns on her fingers from crack pipes. She was suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. The drug counselor told them that Maria had likely been using heavily for months. The window for easy intervention had already passed. She was an addict now, and getting clean would require intensive treatment, support, and in all likelihood, multiple attempts. Roberto sat in that hospital corridor with his head in his hands and wept. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd done everything right. He worked hard, paid his taxes, went to church. He'd taught his children values. How had he failed to protect his little girl from this? Carmen held him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Their daughter had been stolen from them, and the thieves were still out there on Freeman Street, laughing and counting their money and looking for the next Maria to destroy. Maria came home from the hospital, and for a few days things seemed better. She cried and apologized. She promised she was done with drugs forever. She hugged Carlos and told him she was sorry for being mean. Roberto wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But Carmen saw the truth in her daughter's eyes. The craving hadn't gone away. The monster was just sleeping. On a Tuesday evening in early August, Carmen came home from work to find her jewelry box empty. Maria was gone. The money Carmen kept in the kitchen for emergencies was gone too. Carmen sat down on the edge of her bed and made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't save her daughter alone. The drug counselors with their programs and pamphlets weren't enough. The police didn't care. The system had already written Maria off as another statistic. If her daughter was going to have any chance at life, Carmen needed to remove the source of the poison. She needed to find the men who'd done this to her child. Carmen had grown up poor in Santo Domingo, in a neighborhood where the police were as dangerous as the criminals. She'd learned early that sometimes justice had to be taken, not asked for. She'd also learned how to be patient, how to watch and listen, and how to recognize when men underestimated her because she was a woman. The dealers on Freeman Street were about to learn that a mother's love is the most dangerous force on earth. She started with Miguel. Her son was 16, already man-sized, with his father's strength and his mother's cunning. She told him what she needed him to do, and she saw the anger flash in his eyes. Miguel had watched his sister deteriorate. He'd heard her crying in her room at night. He'd seen the way his father's shoulders had slumped under the weight of helplessness. He was ready for this. Together, Carmen and Miguel began surveillance. She would walk past the Freeman Street apartment building on her way home from work, noting who came and went. Miguel would skip his after-school job at the grocery store to watch the dealers from various vantage points, memorizing faces, tracking patterns. They learned that there were about 8 regular guys working out of the apartment. Danny was one of them. There was also Marcus, a tall man with gold teeth who seemed to be in charge. There was Jose, Puerto Rican, always wearing expensive sneakers. There were others, younger guys, lookouts and runners. Carmen didn't tell Roberto what she was planning. Her husband was a good man, which meant he still believed in the law, in the idea that the system would eventually work. She couldn't afford his goodness right now. She needed something harder, colder. She needed the part of herself that she'd buried when she crossed the border into America, the part that understood that some weeds needed to be pulled up by the roots. She found Maria again a week later, working a corner on Southern Boulevard. Her daughter didn't recognize her at first. Carmen almost didn't recognize Maria either. In less than 2 weeks, her child had transformed into a ghost, her skin gray, her eyes vacant. Carmen didn't approach her. She just watched, memorizing the intersection, noting which dealers supplied the girls working that stretch. She followed one of them, a young man maybe 20 years old with a scar across his left eyebrow. He led her back to Freeman Street. The circle was complete. Miguel asked his mother what the plan was. Carmen told him they were going to hit the dealers where it hurt, their money and their product, and they were going to make sure every single one of them faced consequences. Not arrest, not prison, but something permanent. Miguel asked if they were really going to kill these men. Carmen looked at her son with eyes that had lost all softness and said that some people forfeit their right to live when they destroy children. The question of morality could wait. First came preparation. Carmen knew they couldn't do this alone. She reached out to her brother Julio, who'd come to New York 2 years earlier and worked construction in Queens. Julio had a reputation back in Santo Domingo as someone who didn't back down from fights. More importantly, he knew people, the kind of people who could get weapons and wouldn't ask too many questions. When Carmen explained what had happened to Maria, Julio's face went dark. He was in. The three of them spent 2 weeks planning. They watched the Freeman Street apartment constantly, mapping out routines. They learned that the big drug deliveries came on Wednesday nights. They learned that Marcus usually had between 3 and 5 guys with him at any given time. They learned where the dealers parked their cars, which bodegas they frequented, which women they saw. They compiled a list of names and faces. 24 dealers in total who worked for or with Marcus's crew, some based in the Freeman Street apartment, others operating from different locations but connected to the same supply chain. Roberto noticed his wife's distraction but attributed it to grief. He was drowning in his own helplessness. Maria had been home twice more, each time to steal something she could sell. Each time Roberto begged her to stay to get help. Each time she promised she would and then disappeared again. He started drinking, something he'd never done before, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of rum and staring at his daughter's school picture. The girl in that photo was already dead and both he and Carmen knew it. The first move came on a Wednesday night in late August. Carmen, Miguel and Julio watched from a stolen car as 2 dealers made their regular delivery to the Freeman Street apartment, bringing in bags of product from a supplier uptown. They waited until the dealers left, then followed them. At a red light in Hunts Point, Julio pulled up alongside their car. Miguel, wearing a ski mask, leaned out the window with a baseball bat and smashed the driver's side window. Before the dealers could react, Julio was out of the car with a gun, a revolver he'd gotten from a construction site security guard who owed him money. They took everything. The drugs, the money, the dealers' jewelry and weapons. Miguel smashed the dealers' kneecaps with the bat, methodical strikes that shattered bone. Julio told them in Spanish that this was a message, that everyone who sold drugs in this neighborhood was now a target, that there was a family hunting them. The dealers screamed and bled on the pavement. Carmen watched from the car, her face expressionless. They burned the drugs in an abandoned lot, hundreds of dollars worth of crack cocaine going up in flames. They kept the money, almost $4,000, which they would need for what came next. The dealers' guns went into the Harlem River. Carmen felt nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction, just a cold sense of purpose. Word spread fast in the criminal world. 2 dealers from Marcus's crew had been robbed and beaten by unknown assailants. Marcus was furious. He put word out on the street that he wanted information. He increased security at the Freeman Street apartment. He started carrying a gun everywhere. He thought he was dealing with a rival crew trying to move in on his territory. He had no idea he was being hunted by a middle-aged seamstress and her family. The second hit came a week later. Jose, the dealer with the expensive sneakers, lived in a ground-floor apartment on Intervale Avenue. Carmen learned his schedule through patient observation. Every Thursday, he left his apartment at 10 in the evening to meet his girlfriend in Tremont. He always walked the same route, cutting through a small park to save time. Carmen, Miguel, and Julio waited for him in the shadows. When Jose entered the park, they moved. Miguel hit him from behind, a tackle that drove Jose face first into the dirt. Julio was on him immediately, binding his hands with zip ties. Jose started to scream, but Carmen stuffed a rag in his mouth. They dragged him to a maintenance shed at the edge of the park, a place Carmen had scouted days earlier, where the lock was broken and nobody went at night. Inside the shed, by the light of a single flashlight, Carmen looked Jose in the eyes and asked if he remembered Maria Reyes. Jose shook his head frantically. Carmen described her daughter. The recognition came slowly, then all at once. Jose's eyes widened. He tried to speak around the gag. Carmen pulled it out. Jose stammered that he was sorry, that he didn't force the girl to do anything, that she came to them. Carmen asked if he understood that Maria was 14 years old. Jose went pale. Carmen asked if he had children. Jose nodded. Carmen asked if he'd want someone to sell drugs to his children. Jose started crying. Miguel poured gasoline from a can they'd brought while Julio held Jose down. The dealer started screaming, begging, promising he'd leave the neighborhood, that he'd never sell drugs again. Carmen told him it was too late for promises. She told him that 24 dealers had destroyed her daughter, and all 24 would pay. She told him to send a message to the others if he survived. Then she lit a match. The fire started on Jose's legs. The screams were inhuman. After 30 seconds, Julio used a blanket to smother the flames. Jose's lower body was a mass of burned flesh and ruined skin. He'd passed out from the pain. They left him there, knowing someone would find him in the morning. Knowing he'd live but he'd never walk right again, and every time he looked at his scars, he'd remember what happened when you destroy children. If you're watching this and your heart is racing, hit that like button. Comment below and tell us, can you understand what drove the Reyes family to do this? Is this justice or revenge? Keep watching because this story gets even more intense. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our investigations into true crime history. The South Bronx erupted in chaos. 2 separate attacks on drug dealers. One left crippled, another burned so badly he'd spend months in the hospital. The police started investigating but nobody was talking. In neighborhoods like this, you didn't cooperate with cops, even when the victims were criminals. Marcus and his crew were terrified. They started moving in groups. They stopped going anywhere alone. They armed themselves heavily. Marcus thought he was in a drug war. He still didn't understand he was prey. Roberto finally learned what his wife was doing when he overheard her and Miguel talking in the kitchen late one night. He stood outside the doorway, listening as Carmen described their next target. His first instinct was horror. His wife, the woman who went to church every Sunday who kissed her children goodnight, was talking about burning drug dealers. But as he listened more, as he heard the cold calculation in her voice, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He wanted to join them. Roberto Reyes had always considered himself a good man. He believed in God, in law, in doing things the right way. But good men have limits. When he'd held Maria in the hospital, feeling her bones through her skin, something in him had broken. When she'd stolen from her own family to buy drugs, something in him had died. The Roberto who believed in the system was gone. In his place was a father who understood that sometimes the world doesn't care about your children, so you have to care enough for everyone. He walked into the kitchen and looked at his wife. Carmen met his eyes, prepared for condemnation. Instead, Roberto asked how he could help. Carmen started to argue, to tell him he should stay out of it, to protect him from what she was becoming. Roberto cut her off. He said they were a family and they would finish this together. Miguel looked at his father with new respect. The boy was watching his parents transform from law-abiding immigrants into something ancient and primal, the protectors of the tribe at any cost. With Roberto involved, their capacity for damage increased. He brought mechanical skills and knowledge of cars. He brought strength and a steady hand. He also brought something else, righteous anger. Carmen's rage was cold and controlled. Roberto's was a furnace, burning hot and hungry for fuel. Together they were a surgical strike team. The third target was a younger dealer named Flaco, barely 18, who worked as a lookout and runner. They grabbed him as he walked home from the Freeman Street apartment at 2 in the morning. Roberto drove while Miguel and Julio held Flaco in the back seat. They took him to an abandoned warehouse in Hunts Point, a place Roberto had found through his work connections, where nobody would hear anything. They chained Flaco to a support beam. Carmen was the interrogator. She asked him about the operation, about how they recruited girls, about how many Marias there were. Flaco tried to play tough at first, but when Roberto brought out a propane torch, the boy's courage evaporated. He told them everything. He gave them names, addresses, and descriptions. He told them about apartments they didn't know about. He told them that Marcus had put a $10,000 bounty on whoever was hitting his crew. He told them about dealers who worked out of a bodega on Prospect Avenue and a chop shop in Marisania. He gave them a road map to the entire operation. When he was done talking, Carmen asked him why he sold drugs to children. Flaco said he needed the money, that he had a sick mother, that he didn't have other options. Roberto asked if Flaco thought Maria had options when they got her addicted. Flaco started crying, saying he was sorry, that he was just trying to survive. Carmen told him that apologies don't give her daughter back her future. Miguel doused Flaco in gasoline. This time they burned his arms and chest. They let him scream until his voice gave out. Then they left him chained there, knowing the warehouse workers would find him in the morning. Knowing he'd carry the scars forever. Knowing every dealer in the South Bronx would hear about what happened and realize they were being hunted by something they didn't understand. September arrived and the Reyes family had become ghosts. They didn't just want revenge anymore. They wanted eradication. Using the information from Flaco, they mapped out a campaign that would systematically dismantle Marcus's entire operation. They had a list of 24 names. 3 were already done. 21 to go. The attacks came faster now. They hit a dealer named Paco at his girlfriend's apartment, catching him in the stairwell. Roberto beat him unconscious with a pipe wrench while Miguel stood watch. They dragged him to the roof and set his clothes on fire, letting him wake up to flames. By the time they extinguished him, Paco was burned across 40% of his body. They caught two dealers, Carlos and Manny, together at a dice game in an alley. Julio blocked the entrance with the car while Carmen, Roberto, and Miguel moved in with bats and gasoline. The other gamblers ran. Carlos and Manny fought back, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of the assault. Roberto broke Carlos's jaw with a single punch. Miguel shattered Manny's orbital bone with a bat. They burned them both, methodically, professionally. The screams echoed through the alley like sirens. The South Bronx drug trade started to collapse. Dealers were terrified to work. Marcus's crew was falling apart. Nobody knew who was safe. The attacks were random, unpredictable. Sometimes days would pass between incidents. Sometimes two dealers would be hit in the same night. The only pattern was the fire and the brutality. And the message that always accompanied it: this is for the children you destroyed. Maria came home in mid-September, sick and desperate. She'd heard about what was happening on the streets. Everyone had. The word was that some crazy family was burning dealers over a girl who'd gotten addicted. Maria didn't connect it to herself at first. The drugs had eaten so much of her mind that she couldn't see the obvious. But when she saw her mother's hands, scarred from splashed gasoline, when she saw the way Miguel moved with new confidence, when she saw the darkness in her father's eyes, understanding dawned. She confronted Carmen in the kitchen. Asked her mother if it was true. If the stories about the burned dealers were about her. Carmen didn't lie. She told Maria that yes, they were making everyone who'd hurt her pay. She told her daughter that 24 dealers had conspired to destroy her, so 24 dealers would suffer. Maria started to cry. She said she didn't want this, that she'd made her own choices, that people had died for her. Carmen gripped her daughter's shoulders and said that nobody dies for making a choice when that choice was engineered by predators. She said that Maria was a child, and the adults who'd weaponized her addiction were responsible for every consequence that followed. Maria asked if they were going to kill Danny. Carmen said yes. Maria begged her not to. She said Danny had been kind to her at first, that he'd cared about her. Carmen's face went hard. She told Maria that a predator's kindness is the sharpest knife. That Danny had seen a smart, beautiful girl with dreams and deliberately turned her into an addict because she was valuable that way. That his kindness was calculated, a tool to make her complicit in her own destruction. Maria collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing because she knew it was true. Roberto put Maria in a detox program, a place in Westchester that cost money they didn't have, but they used the stolen drug money to pay for it. Before she left, Maria asked her father to stop. Roberto told her that parents don't stop protecting their children just because it's hard or frightening or turns them into monsters. He told her that he'd cross any line, break any law, stain his soul any color necessary if it meant she had a chance to live. Maria went to Westchester carrying the knowledge that her family had become weapons forged in the fire of her addiction. The police investigation intensified. 8 dealers burned or beaten in 6 weeks. This wasn't gang violence. This was something else. Detectives noticed that the victims all worked for or with Marcus's crew. They noticed that none of the victims would talk about what happened. They noticed that the attacks always involved fire. They started calling the perpetrators the burners in police reports. They had no suspects. No witnesses. Just a growing list of victims and a neighborhood that seemed almost relieved by the violence. Marcus went into hiding. He moved from the Freeman Street apartment to a safe house in Yonkers. He stopped dealing personally, running his operation through intermediaries. He thought distance would save him. He didn't understand that Carmen had his photograph and his license plate number and the address of his mother in the Dominican Republic. He didn't understand that the Reyes family had decided that the head of the snake needed to burn last, after he'd watched his entire operation collapse. Target number 12 was a dealer named Ray, who specialized in recruiting high school kids. Carmen learned he picked up girls outside Morris High School, Maria's old school. She watched him for 3 days, seething. On the 3rd day, Roberto and Miguel grabbed him as he left a McDonald's. They took him to the same warehouse they'd used before. This time they didn't ask questions. Ray had preyed on children at a school. There was nothing to interrogate. They doused him in gasoline and lit him on fire. They watched him burn for a full minute before putting him out. Ray survived, but the burns covered 70% of his body. He'd never look human again. Comment below if you think the Reyes family went too far, or if you think they were doing what the system failed to do. This story is about to reach its most intense moment. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss how this ends. October arrived with unseasonably cold weather. The Reyes family had burned or beaten 14 dealers. They had 10 more on their list. The South Bronx drug trade had never been more disrupted. Addicts were going through withdrawal because product was scarce and dealers were too scared to operate openly. The other criminal organizations watched in fascination and horror, wondering if they'd be next. The police pressure was increasing. Someone would eventually talk. The family knew their time was limited. They accelerated the campaign. In one brutal week, they hit 4 dealers. A guy named Tito who operated from a barber shop. They caught him after closing and beat him with chairs before setting the shop on fire with him inside. He escaped with third-degree burns on his back and legs. A dealer named Angel who worked from a club. They grabbed him in the parking lot and burned his hands so badly his fingers fused together. 2 enforcers for Marcus named Big Lou and Chino. They cornered them in a stairwell and burned them both, one after another, making each watch the other's torture. 18 dealers down. 6 to go. The neighborhood was in chaos. The media had picked up the story. Local news ran pieces about vigilante violence in the South Bronx. Community leaders were divided. Some condemned the violence. Others quietly supported it, tired of watching their children destroyed by drugs. The police commissioner promised arrests. Activists called it urban terrorism. But in the buildings and on the corners where real people lived with the daily reality of crack cocaine, opinions were different. People whispered that maybe some problems couldn't be solved with social programs and understanding. Maybe some problems needed fire. Roberto sat with Carmen one night after they'd burned a dealer named Sammy and asked her if she thought they'd go to hell for this. Carmen said she didn't know, but if there was a hell for burning drug dealers, there must be a worse hell for people who addict children. She said God would have to judge which sin was greater. Roberto said he could live with that judgment. He said he'd already lived through hell watching Maria deteriorate. Nothing that came after could be worse than the helplessness he'd felt. Target 19 was a woman named Lisa, one of the few female dealers in Marcus's crew. She was 22 and had been instrumental in recruiting girls like Maria. Carmen felt no sisterhood with her. Female predators were still predators. They grabbed Lisa outside her apartment in Soundview. Julio drove while Carmen and Miguel handled her. They took her to an empty lot. Carmen did the burning herself, methodically setting Lisa's legs on fire while Miguel recorded the woman's screams on a camera they'd bought specifically to send a message. They left the tape on Marcus's mother's doorstep with a note that said he was next. 20 dealers burned or beaten. 4 to go. Danny, Marcus, and 2 of Marcus's most loyal enforcers remained. The Reyes family saved them for last because they wanted Marcus to watch his empire die. They wanted him to understand that everything he'd built was ashes because he'd chosen to profit from destroying children. They wanted him to know that the 14-year-old girl he'd helped addict had a family that loved her enough to become monsters. They found one of the enforcers, a man named Gordo, at his mother's house where he'd gone into hiding. They waited until his mother left for work, then broke in. Gordo was armed but he was slow. Miguel disarmed him and Roberto beat him unconscious. They dragged him to the basement, bound him to the water heater, and this time they used accelerant that burned hotter and longer. Gordo's screams were so loud that neighbors called the police, but by the time anyone arrived, the Reyes family was gone, and Gordo was a burned ruin of a human being. 21 down. 3 to go. The police were closing in. They'd found witnesses, people who'd seen a Hispanic family near several attack sites. They had descriptions of the car Julio drove. They had footage from a security camera that showed Miguel and Roberto grabbing one of the dealers. The detectives knew they were looking for a family. They just didn't know which family yet. Carmen knew they had days, maybe a week at most, before someone made the connection. They decided to finish it all in one night. November 5, 1988. The night the Reyes family would complete their vengeance. They'd spent weeks planning this final act. They knew where Marcus was hiding. They knew where his last enforcer lived. And they knew where to find Danny, still operating because he was either too stupid or too arrogant to understand the danger. They started with the enforcer, a man named Hector. Roberto and Julio grabbed him outside a strip club in Hunts Point. They beat him unconscious and took him to the warehouse. They chained him next to the support beam where they'd interrogated Flaco. Carmen set him on fire and they watched him burn. They didn't put him out. Hector died screaming, the first person the Reyes family had actually killed. Carmen felt no remorse. She felt nothing at all. The fire inside her had burned away everything except purpose. 22 down. 2 to go. Danny was at an apartment in Marisania with a new girl he was recruiting, another high school student with dreams he would systematically destroy. Miguel kicked in the door while Roberto and Julio followed. Danny went for a gun, but Roberto shot him in the leg with a weapon they'd taken from one of the other dealers. The girl ran. They let her go. She wasn't the target. Danny was. They dragged him down the stairs, leaving a trail of blood. Danny begged. He said he was sorry about Maria. He said he loved her. He said he'd been trying to get clean himself. Miguel hit him so hard it broke his nose. Carmen told Danny that he'd seen a vulnerable child and chosen to destroy her. That he'd taken a girl with a future and turned her into a commodity. That his apologies were as worthless as his life. They took him to an abandoned building on Freeman Street, 3 blocks from where it all started. They chained him to a radiator. Carmen doused him in gasoline personally. She looked in his eyes and told him this was for Maria, for every girl he'd destroyed, for every parent who'd watched helplessly as dealers stole their children. Danny screamed that it wasn't just him, that Marcus made him do it, that he was just following orders. Roberto told him that following orders to destroy children doesn't absolve you of anything. Then Carmen lit the match. Danny burned. They watched him for 30 seconds before Miguel put him out. He was still alive, covered in burns, his skin peeling and blackened. He'd live, but he'd carry the scars forever. They left him there, knowing someone would find him eventually. Knowing the message was clear. The people who destroyed Maria Reyes had all paid the price. 23 down. 1 to go. Marcus had gone completely underground. His mother wouldn't tell them where he was. His associates had all scattered. The Reyes family spent 2 days searching before they got a break. Julio's construction crew friend saw Marcus at a hotel in Yonkers. He was leaving town, heading to Miami to start over. Carmen realized they had one chance. If Marcus got on that plane, it was over. They found him at the hotel on the morning of November 7th. He was loading bags into a rental car. Miguel and Julio grabbed him in the parking lot in broad daylight. Marcus fought back hard, landing punches, but he was 1 man against 3. Roberto hit him with a tire iron and Marcus went down. They stuffed him in the trunk of Julio's car and drove back to the South Bronx, to the warehouse where they'd done so much of their work. Inside the warehouse, they chained Marcus to the same support beam that had held so many of his dealers. Carmen stood in front of him and told him who she was. Marcus's eyes widened with recognition. He'd heard about Maria Reyes. The word on the street was that the burners were her family. He'd thought it was a rumor. The idea that a middle-aged seamstress and her family could have destroyed his entire operation seemed impossible. Carmen told him everything. She told him how they'd watched and planned. She told him how they'd hunted his dealers one by one. She told him that 23 of his people had been burned or beaten, that 1 was dead, that the rest would carry scars forever. She told him that she'd done it all because he and his crew had decided it was profitable to destroy her 14-year-old daughter. Marcus tried to negotiate. He offered money, lots of money. He offered to leave New York forever. He offered to tell them where other dealers operated. Carmen wasn't interested. She told him that nothing he could offer would give Maria back the innocence he'd stolen. That no amount of money would erase the nights Maria had spent on corners selling herself for drugs. That his life was already over. They were just deciding how painful the end would be. Roberto wanted to kill him. Julio wanted to kill him. Miguel wanted to kill him. But Carmen had a different idea. She said that Marcus needed to live. That he needed to exist as a testament to what happened when you preyed on children. That death would be mercy, and she wasn't offering mercy. They burned Marcus methodically. Carmen directed it like an orchestra conductor. Face first, so every time he looked in a mirror he'd see the price of his choices. Then his chest. Then his arms and hands. They used accelerant that burned slow and hot. Marcus's screams echoed through the warehouse. Until his voice gave out. They kept him conscious through it all, using smelling salts when he started to fade. They wanted him to experience every second. When they were done, Marcus was more scar tissue than skin. They left him chained in the warehouse and called an ambulance from a payphone. Carmen told the dispatcher that a drug dealer who'd addicted children was at this address and needed medical attention. Then they went home. 24 dealers. All accounted for. The mission was complete. If this story has impacted you, show us by hitting that like button. Comment and tell us what you think about the Reyes family's choice. And subscribe because we have more incredible true stories coming. Now let's talk about what happened after. The police arrested the Reyes family 3 days later. Someone from Marcus's crew had finally talked, desperate to get the vigilantes off the streets before they came back. When the detectives showed up at the Prospect Avenue apartment, Roberto, Carmen, Miguel, and Julio didn't resist. They'd known this was coming. They'd accomplished what they set out to do. The consequences were just the price of admission. The trial became a media sensation. The prosecution portrayed the Reyes family as dangerous criminals who'd conducted a terrorism campaign in the South Bronx. They brought in 23 victims, all burned and broken, to testify about their torture. The pictures of their injuries were horrific. The jury looked nauseated. The prosecutor said this was about the rule of law, that vigilante justice destroyed civilized society. The defense attorney took a different approach. He brought in Maria, now 3 months clean from rehab, looking thin but healthier than she'd been in months. She testified about how the dealers had groomed her, how they'd deliberately gotten her addicted, how they'd exploited her youth and vulnerability. She cried on the stand as she described the things she'd done for drugs, the way they'd passed her around like property. The defense brought in other families from the neighborhood. Parents who'd lost children to overdoses. Parents whose kids were still addicted. They testified about how they'd begged for help from the police, from social services, from politicians. How nothing changed. How the dealers operated openly, destroying children while the system looked the other way. The jury deliberated for 6 days. It was clear they were torn. Legally, the Reyes family was guilty of assault, attempted murder, and in the case of Hector, murder itself. But morally, emotionally, the case was more complex. These were not evil people. They were parents who'd watched the system fail their daughter and decided to create their own justice. The verdict came back mixed. Guilty on assault charges. Guilty on arson. Guilty of manslaughter for Hector's death. But not guilty of attempted murder for the others, the jury determining that the Reyes family had deliberately kept victims alive as a message rather than trying to kill them. The conviction came with a sentence. Roberto got 15 years. Carmen got 12. Miguel was tried as a juvenile and got 5 years. Julio got 10. Before sentencing, the judge allowed each family member to speak. Roberto stood and said he'd do it all again. That his daughter was alive and getting clean because they'd removed the predators who'd addicted her. That he'd gladly spend the rest of his life in prison if it meant Maria had a future. Carmen said she wasn't sorry for what she'd done, only sorry that the system had failed so completely that parents had to become monsters to protect their children. Miguel said he'd learned from his parents that family meant everything, and he'd carry that lesson with him always. Julio said simply that his niece had needed him and he'd answered the call. The judge, a woman named Sandra Martinez who'd grown up in the Bronx, delivered an unusual sentencing statement. She said that while she had to uphold the law, she understood the desperation that had driven the Reyes family to these extremes. She said that the drug epidemic had destroyed countless families and that the system's failure to protect children was unconscionable. She said she hoped this case would force society to confront the question of what happens when institutions fail so completely that ordinary people feel they have no choice but to take justice into their own hands. She also said something that made headlines. She said that while she couldn't condone vigilante violence, she understood why many in the community saw the Reyes family as heroes rather than criminals. She said that perhaps the real criminals were the policymakers and law enforcement officials who'd allowed the crack epidemic to devastate neighborhoods like the South Bronx without meaningful intervention. The Reyes family went to prison in January 1989. But their story didn't end there. Marcus survived his burns but was left so disfigured and damaged that he could barely function. He never dealt drugs again. He lived in a facility for severely disabled adults, a living testimony to the consequences of preying on children. Danny survived but lost his sight from the burns. He spent years in physical therapy learning to function again. None of the 23 dealers who'd been burned or beaten ever returned to the drug trade. The message had been clear and permanent. Maria stayed clean. It took years of therapy and multiple relapses, but she eventually graduated from community college and became a substance abuse counselor. She dedicated her life to helping other girls who'd been exploited by dealers. She never forgot what her family sacrificed for her, carrying the weight of their imprisonment as motivation to make her life mean something. The South Bronx drug trade was disrupted for months after the Reyes campaign. Other dealers operated more cautiously, avoided recruiting young girls, and understood that there were potential consequences beyond arrest. Some community activists said the violence had been necessary and effective. Others said it had traumatized the neighborhood and solved nothing. The debate continues to this day. In prison, Roberto and Carmen became advocates for drug treatment programs and tougher penalties for dealers who targeted children. They gave interviews to journalists and documentary filmmakers. Their story became a case study in criminology classes about the limits of law and the power of parental love. Some professors used them as an example of justified vigilantism. Others used them as a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning the rule of law. Miguel served his 5 years and was released at 21. He became a youth counselor working with at-risk kids in the Bronx. He never forgot the things he'd done, the people he'd burned, but he channeled the intensity that had made him an effective vigilante into protecting other children from the same fate as his sister. The most unexpected development came in 1995. A group of community activists and family advocacy organizations launched a campaign to get the Reyes family pardoned or have their sentences commuted. They argued that the family had done what the system failed to do, that they'd protected a child when no one else would. They collected thousands of signatures. Local politicians, aware of the support, began calling for clemency. In 1997, after serving 8 years, Carmen was granted early release for good behavior and because of her age and health issues from prison. She came home to find that Maria was thriving, that Carlos was in college, that Miguel was doing good work in the community. She'd missed years of their lives, but she'd also given them a chance to have lives at all. Roberto was released in 2002 after 13 years. He was 62 years old, his hair white, his body weakened by prison life. But when he walked out and saw Maria waiting for him, healthy and sober and alive, he said it was worth every day. They hugged for a long time, father and daughter, survivor and protector, both irrevocably changed by the fire they'd lived through. Julio served his full sentence and was released in 1999. Miguel was out by 1994. The family reunited gradually, carrying the scars of what they'd done and what had been done to them. They never lived in the South Bronx again. The memories were too heavy. They moved to Connecticut and tried to build something resembling normal lives. In 2008, a journalist published a book about the case called The Fire of Vengeance: The Reyes Family and the South Bronx Drug War. It became a bestseller and reignited debate about the case. Some readers saw the family as heroes. Others saw them as criminals who'd undermined justice. Most were simply moved by the story of parents who'd loved their daughter enough to destroy themselves trying to save her. Maria, now in her 30s, gave her first major interview for the book. She talked about living with the knowledge that 24 people had been burned or beaten because of her addiction. She talked about the guilt and the gratitude, the way they existed simultaneously in her heart. She said she'd spent years in therapy trying to process what her family had done and why. She said she understood now that addiction had made her a victim, but it had also made her valuable as a tool to destroy other children, and her family had dismantled the machine rather than watch it run. She also said something that struck many readers. She said that her family's violence hadn't solved the drug epidemic. That crack cocaine still devastated communities. That new dealers always emerged to replace the old ones. That what her family did was specific and personal, not a solution to systemic problems. She said maybe the real lesson wasn't about whether their violence was justified, but about what it said about society that parents felt they had no other options. In 2015, Roberto Reyes died of heart disease at 75. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from the Bronx, many who'd never met him but knew his story. Parents who'd lost children to drugs. Recovering addicts who'd been inspired by Maria's story. Community activists who saw the Reyes family as symbols of both the failures of the system and the strength of family bonds. The priest who gave the eulogy said that Roberto had been a complicated man who'd done terrible things for understandable reasons, and that perhaps that's all any of us are in the end. Carmen lived until 2020, passing away at 81. In her final years, she'd become something of a folk hero in certain communities, a grandmother figure who'd once been a warrior. She never expressed regret for what she'd done. In her last interview, given when she was 79, she said that if she had to do it all again, she'd burn every single one of them again. She said some people forfeit their claim to mercy when they destroy children, and she'd go to her grave believing that. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if this story affected you. Give us a like if you think this is the kind of content that makes you think. And comment below with your opinion. Did the Reyes family do the right thing? Is there ever a justification for taking justice into your own hands? These are questions that don't have easy answers, and that's what makes this story so powerful. The legacy of the Reyes family is complicated. In the South Bronx, there are still people who remember the summer and fall of 1988, when drug dealers were hunted through the streets by a family that refused to let their daughter be another statistic. Some remember it as a time of terror. Others remember it as a time when someone finally stood up to predators who'd operated with impunity for too long. Criminologists still debate the case. Some argue that the Reyes family's actions were effective deterrents, that the brutality of their campaign made other dealers more cautious about targeting young people. Others argue that the violence simply created a power vacuum that other criminal organizations filled, that nothing fundamentally changed except that more people were hurt. Legal scholars use the case to discuss questions of justification and necessity in criminal law. When, if ever, is vigilante justice acceptable? What obligations does the state have to protect citizens before those citizens feel compelled to protect themselves? If the system fails, do individuals have the right to create their own justice? These are questions without clear answers. Ethicists debate whether parental love justifies extreme violence. Is there a moral difference between the Reyes family burning drug dealers and those dealers addicting children? Both caused tremendous harm. Both justified their actions through their own moral frameworks. Can we condemn one without condemning the other? Or are some violations so severe that proportionate response ceases to matter? In the neighborhood where it happened, the story has taken on almost mythical qualities. Parents tell their children about the Reyes family as a warning and an inspiration. Don't let anyone exploit you because someone who loves you might do terrible things to protect you. It's a complex lesson mixing love and violence, protection and vengeance, in ways that don't resolve neatly. Miguel Reyes, now in his 50s, runs a nonprofit that provides resources to families dealing with addiction. He's never hidden his past. In fact, he uses it to connect with parents who are desperate, who are watching their children die slowly and feeling helpless. He tells them he understands that desperation. He also tells them there are better ways, legal ways, ways that don't require destroying yourself to save your child. But he acknowledges that his family couldn't see those ways in 1988, and he doesn't judge parents who feel similarly trapped now. Maria Reyes, in her 50s as well, has never used drugs again after that final stay in rehab in 1988. She's been sober for over 35 years. She's married now, has children of her own, and works as a counselor specializing in adolescent addiction. Her children know their mother's story. They know what their grandparents and uncle did. They know that they exist because people who loved their mother were willing to burn the world down to save her. Carlos, the youngest Reyes child, grew up largely without his parents during his teenage years. He became a teacher working in the same neighborhood where the family once lived. He teaches history and civics, and sometimes he uses his own family's story as a case study in the complexity of justice. He doesn't tell his students who he is, but he presents the case and asks them to grapple with the questions it raises. Year after year, his classes are split in their conclusions, just as society remains split. The dealers who survived carry their scars. Some died young, unrelated to the Reyes family, victims of the lifestyle they'd chosen. Others got out of the drug trade and tried to rebuild their lives. A few became advocates themselves, talking to at-risk youth about the consequences of getting involved in dealing. They carry the burns as permanent reminders that actions have consequences, that the children they exploited had families who loved them enough to become monsters. One of the burn dealers, Paco, who'd lost much of his torso skin, gave an interview in 2010. He said he understood why the Reyes family did what they did. That looking back, he realized he'd been part of something evil, that recruiting and addicting kids had been monstrous regardless of his need for money or his own addiction. He said the burns had given him a second chance at life, that every time he looked at his scars he remembered that he'd participated in destroying children and that he'd gotten off easy compared to what he deserved. Not all the victims felt that way. Several sued the Reyes family for damages, though the lawsuits went nowhere as the family had no assets. Others remained angry, feeling that their punishment had been disproportionate to their crimes, that they'd been denied due process, that being burned alive by vigilantes was never justified regardless of what they'd done. The question of proportionality haunts the case. Were the Reyes family's actions proportionate to the harm done to Maria? If we accept that deliberately addicting a child is a form of violence, then perhaps burning the perpetrators is a form of self-defense or defense of others. But if we see addiction as a disease and dealers as people responding to economic incentives in a broken system, then the burnings seem like excessive brutality inflicted on people who were themselves trapped in cycles of poverty and crime. There's no consensus. Different people, depending on their values and experiences, come to different conclusions. Parents who've lost children to addiction tend to sympathize with the Reyes family. People who've been involved in the criminal justice system tend to emphasize the importance of legal process. People who grew up in neighborhoods devastated by crack cocaine often have the most nuanced views, understanding both the desperation that drives vigilantism and the dangers it poses to community safety. What everyone agrees on is that the case illuminates failures. The failure of drug policy in the 1980s to protect communities from crack cocaine. The failure of social services to provide adequate addiction treatment, especially for young people. The failure of law enforcement to prevent dealers from openly recruiting children. The failure of economic systems that left young men feeling that dealing drugs was their best option for survival. The Reyes family's violence was a symptom of these compounding failures, a pressure cooker exploding when the heat became unbearable. In recent years, as the opioid epidemic has devastated new communities, often whiter and more suburban than the crack epidemic's victims, the Reyes family story has gained new relevance. Parents in Ohio and West Virginia and New Hampshire watching their children die from fentanyl understand the rage and helplessness that drove the Reyes family to violence. Some have even cited the case when discussing how they'd like to see pharmaceutical executives and dealers prosecuted. The story resonates because parental love and desperation are universal, even if the specific responses are not. The 24 dealers burned by the Reyes family represent more than just individuals. They represent a system that commodified addiction, that turned children into profit margins, that operated on the calculation that destroying young lives was an acceptable cost of doing business. The Reyes family's response, brutal as it was an assertion that there are lines that cannot be crossed without consequences, that children cannot be sacrificed to economic logic without someone fighting back. Whether that fight was justified remains an open question. Whether it was effective is debatable. Whether it changed anything systemic is unclear. But what's certain is that for 3 months in 1988, 4 people loved a girl named Maria Reyes enough to transform themselves into instruments of vengeance, to sacrifice their freedom and their souls to give her a chance at life. Maria herself, when asked if she thinks her family did the right thing, usually pauses for a long time before answering. She'll say that she wishes it hadn't been necessary. That she wishes the system had protected her. That she wishes addiction hadn't stolen her childhood and forced her family into impossible choices. But then she'll say that she's alive, that she's been sober for decades, that she has children and a career and a life, and she's not sure any of that would exist if her family hadn't done what they did. She'll say that 24 people were burned or beaten because of her, and she carries that weight every day. But she'll also say that those 24 people made choices to destroy children for profit, and consequences shouldn't always be comfortable. She'll say she doesn't know if her family did the right thing, but she knows they did it out of love, and that has to count for something. In the end, the story of the Reyes family and the 24 dealers they burned is not a story with a clear moral. It's a story about the limits of institutional justice and the power of family bonds. It's about the question of what happens when the system fails so completely that ordinary people feel they have no choice but to become extraordinary in their violence. It's about whether love can justify vengeance, whether protection can justify brutality, whether the right goal can ever justify the wrong means. These are questions each person has to answer for themselves. There's no objective truth here, just competing values and impossible choices and the recognition that good people can do terrible things when pushed far enough. The Reyes family believed they did what they had to do. The dealers they burned paid a horrific price. Maria got a second chance at life. Society was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. And all of us are left to decide what we think about it all. One thing is certain. The Reyes family loved their daughter enough to cross every line, break every law, and sacrifice everything they had to save her. That love, fierce and uncompromising and willing to descend into darkness for its object, is both beautiful and terrifying. It's the love that builds civilizations and the love that burns them down. It's the love that makes us human and the love that makes us monsters. In 1988, in the South Bronx, that love took the form of fire. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of the most controversial cases in New York City history. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think differently about justice and family and the choices we make when pushed to our limits, please hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge easy answers and force us to confront difficult questions. Share this video with someone who appreciates complex true crime stories that go beyond simple heroes and villains. And remember, the most important stories are often the ones that don't let us walk away with comfortable conclusions. The Reyes family story is one of those stories, and now you carry it with you too.